I'm grateful for the organizers for being here and also for giving me the honor in a way of concluding the event. We can look at this as the culmination of the whole thing. At the end of all these scientific and factual discussions, we have the judgment, the final judgment of the whole thing, proposed by someone who is coming from the International Criminal Court. I work at the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court that is in The Hague, in the Netherlands, of course, and I've been working for about 20 years now in the investigations of international crimes. I don't do psychology, I don't do neurology, I do criminal investigations, and I do criminal investigations of a very particular type of crimes which are under the statute. Everything is regulated by our statute, of course, defined in Articles 6, 7, and 8 for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. You can read all in our documents in our site. That gives you a catalog of around 60 or so different criminal conduct. So it's a quite broad catalog. The first point that I want to make is that we've been talking a lot about killings particularly, or possibly torture in some examples. That makes sense, that's important. Of course, it's generally understood as the worst form of violence. But there are many other types of extreme cruelty and war crimes in our case and genocide that do not necessarily include killings, right? There is destruction, there is various types of looting, and there is very importantly the various types of sexual violence, which is important in our statute, and it's been also defined as a priority for our prosecutor. And we have to think about that. We have to think whether all the discussions that we are having focus on a particular type of violence, which is killings, would apply the same way to other types of violence, including sexual violence. Let's look at some examples and some of our reality, if I manage to use this properly.
No, it's not connected.
I think it's not connected.
I think you'll have to use the...
All right. Oh, that's unfortunate.
But the dongle is not present.
It goes.
So I think that...
Okay, use this. Can I use some mic? Or
Choose this here.
very good. It is only appropriate to start the presentation with a reference to one of the historical main proponents of international law, who was a Frenchman, diplomat, Baron d'Estournel de Constant, who was, well, France has played a very important role in the development of international law, all the way from the 19th century at least, until today. They have been always an important supporter of the International Criminal Court, since the court was established in 1998, until today through various means of cooperation. Thank you very much, La France. Baron d'Estournel raised an important point around 100 years ago. It is when he in a report on the Balkan Wars, he made the point that it is wrong to blame people against the ethnic and historicist stereotypes. He would say it's not the people who should be blamed, it's the leaders. It is about the leaders. They are the true culprits, those who are above, 1, 2, 3 levels above the foot soldiers. They are the ones who are leading people, who are inciting, who are creating false rumors and giving the orders to commit crimes. This is a fundamental concept in the development of international law. This is also the position, the point of view taken by the Nuremberg trials at the time. The Nuremberg trials were very selective on a very small group of top leaders, and this is also the same policy that we follow. Under the statute, we can prosecute anybody that has, within our parameters of competence, that has committed a crime, but we have chosen as a matter of policy to limit our investigations and to focus on those that we consider the most responsible people. So of course that leads to a very particular type of criminal investigation, right? In a way, our interest is not using the analogy, the comparison with Milgram, wouldn't be the guinea pig or the guy who actually is pressing the button. We will be investigating Milgram himself. Our questions would be, why is this Milgram man, creating this context that leads people to commit violence? And who is this Milgram guy, right? The dialogue between social sciences, lawyers, and science, other types of science, was already present in 1945. I'll recommend for the psychologist and other scientists in the room to take a look at the works of Gustav Gilbert, who was the psychologist working in Nuremberg. His task was to his task was, thank you, to take care of the welfare mainly of the accused, right? That implied a number of, interactions and programs and interviews and so on. So he got to know the perpetrators at a deeper psychological level. And for anybody that wants to read it, there is a book, a very interesting book, which is called the Nuremberg Diary. At the time, one of the points that he made was IQ, right? The IQ level was an important concept for him, and at the time, so he managed to somehow assess the IQ of the different perpetrators, so that he concluded that there were a whole range of IQs, and he did assess that the lowest IQ was shown by Julius Streicher, which is no surprise in a way because he was the most blatant and the ugliest of all perpetrators. He was known for his anti-Semitic propaganda and the publishing of the Sturmer publication, which was the most explicit and ugly, propaganda demonizing, not just dehumanizing, actually demonizing the Jews and so on. And guess what? The highest IQ was shown by the top banker of the Reich. The Reich's banker. It's not so surprising either. Apparently was the smartest guy in the group, and by the way, he was acquitted at the end of the day, right? So, and this picture you can see here, he's actually testifying in a different trial, which is the Eichmann trial. He learned a lot about all that, and then he was invited to testify in Eichmann trial. With more time, I will explain you what was the content of his testimony, actually. The second person is the chief of analysis. So I look at him as sort of my grandfather in Nuremberg. I am in charge of the analysis section within the investigations division. And for us as analysts, what we do is a type of an operational, practical research. We use methods that are similar to criminal investigations and social sciences, but applied to a very specific scope of the case, of the allegations and the evidence to build the cases, ultimately showing individual responsibility. We heard about responsibility earlier today. You can also see his book published in 1942. In two books, one should read both books if you want to look at both sides of the story, right? The psychological side and the political science analysis of the Nazi system. The dialogue continues today. This is what we do. We operate in some 19 situations around the world, 10 of them under investigation these days, and there is a lot to investigate there. Believe me, we have in our division around 80 investigators and some 30 analysts, and that's not enough. Each of us is very, very busy with the missions, with collecting the evidence firsthand. We cannot build a case just on hearsay or secondary sources. We do go there and gather the evidence ourselves. Sorry again. With the missions, the collection of the evidence, and then making sense of the evidence that we have collected, which is the job of our analysts. This is the reality of what we have to deal with. The first picture is victims from Uganda, children escaping from the violence of the Lord Resistance Army. The second one is a victim of the Lord Resistance Army. You have an insurrection, an armed uprising, and then the government response. Very important, the dynamics of insurgency and counter-insurgency. The LRA fighters and leaders told their own people, this is all within the same tribe, by the way, this is the Acholi tribe in northern Uganda, they told them, you cannot talk to the army, you will never give them information. They suspected that this lady had reported to the army, given some information, and as an exemplary punishment to her and others, they will cut the lips in her face, or the nose, or the ears, or anything. It's a mutilation. They deliberately don't kill her because they want to leave her alive as an example for the rest. You can understand that implies, well, extreme cruelty. By the way, none of these pictures is part of the evidence. I'm using only public information for the presentation, obviously. The third slide is a child soldier in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Under our statute, recruiting as soldiers kids younger than 15 years old, it's a crime. And that was the matter for the first trial that we succeeded to complete against Thomas Lubanga, currently convicted. This is another extreme, explicit picture. Sorry for the explicitness. This is January 2009 in Naivasha in the Republic of Kenya in the Rift Valley. There was a conflict, political/tribal conflict. In Kenya you have a very large number of tribes, and it so happens that all of them conduct customarily circumcision of men, male circumcision, except for one tribe, which is the Luo tribe. So if you want to know whether someone is a Luo or not, there is a quite safe way to do that, which is to check whether this person, this man, has been circumcised or not. At the height of the conflict, they set some checkpoints, and those who were against the Luos would stop the men, put the pants down, check, and if the man was not circumcised, they will circumcise him on the spot with a knife, machete, a broken bottle, with the result of not only circumcising, but actually that would result in a full castration and death. These people would bleed to death. Yeah, that's the kind of thing we have to deal with. Sexual violence, very important. Those are victims from Darfur. Is one of the situations that we have investigated, initiated investigation upon request of the UN Security Council, and these are women in refugee camps in Chad, across the border from Sudan, raising the issue of rape as well as child abduction. The last image is also victims of rape in Central African Republic, and this is very close to us these days because this was the case against Jean-Pierre Bemba, a Congolese leader, formerly the vice president of the Republic, who was convicted. We had the sentence just issued a month ago, and it was a success for us. He was convicted, and he was convicted for every single count under Article 28 of our statute, which means command responsibility. He was never convicted for ordering the rapes. This was the main issue in this case, rapes. He was convicted for failing to prevent and punish the rape, a very important concept of command responsibility. So that's what keeps us busy. And this is what analysts do, among other things. We put together the data. We use methods that are, as I said, sometimes similar to criminology or epidemiology or so, quantitative methods. This is a data set of reported killings in Darfur. We plot that chronologically, and we can identify the peaks, right, the periods of higher violence. This is for the aggregate up there for the whole of Darfur. Down here is by the different states, West, North, and South Darfur, because we also want to see the progression, disaggregated chronologically. And in the middle, we just to explore visually correlation with different events, including ceasefires in the conflict and orders from the top level of the military. As an initial exploration, strategically, we can see then the areas of gravest crime, the periods of gravest crime, and indeed some tentative correlation with higher orders. This is still Darfur within the Republic of Sudan. Here, the issue is very much related to a background of racism and ethnic conflict. This is basically the difference between Arab and Black African population. I'm using the terms that they use themselves. I'm just taking their terminology. Against the background even of slavery historically since centuries ago and so on. So we plotted the distribution of the tribes, and then we plotted the same data that I showed before on reported killings to see the correlation geographically between one and the other. All this helped to developing the investigation. This is a plot of a 3D somehow plot of remote sensing data, satellite data, showing the relief, the landscape of the core area where the gravest crimes were committed in Darfur. What happened? You have an armed rebellion, for sure. Rebels is a serious force, thousands of them with weapons, presenting a serious challenge against the government. They succeed in seizing the main city and destroying the military garrison there and the planes. There was an airport there as well. That is taken by the government as a massive provocation. This is something that they cannot accept. And the government, led by President Bashir, still today the president, decides to launch massive violence to quash the rebellion. Now, to understand what happened, we have to make constantly an effort to take the point of view of the perpetrator. As You may have heard about Raoul Hilberg, basically one of the most important historians of the Holocaust. And we know that the secret of success for him was that he was able to put himself somehow in the mind of perpetrators to understand how the machine of the Holocaust was organized. He was the first one among historians that succeeded to take that viewpoint. Hence, his research was able to explain a lot more than merely taking the victim viewpoint. The same happens here and in every single case. So, taking for a moment the point of view of President Bashir, he had a number of problems coming his way. He had the south of Sudan, where he already had a rebellion, and they were winning the rebellion. At this point of time, this is 2004, it was very likely that South Sudan will part ways and go away and gain independence, as they did. So then he has a second rebellion starting in Darfur, in another part of the country. Of course, the rebels are learning from the south. They say, okay, in the south the rebellion is working, they are gaining independence, so let's do the same, obviously. But Bashir is also learning from the same experience, and he's afraid that what happened in the south may happen again in Darfur, in which case he's virtually losing like half of the country, if not more. So that's one problem. This is the president from his viewpoint. Next problem, this is in the border area. Rebels are coming in and out from Chad, carrying their attacks, and they're closely related to Chadians, including in the Chadian government, right? So he's frustrated because he cannot catch them. They're running away all the time across the border. The next problem is that they are also hiding in the mountains, in the higher ground. This is Jebel Mara mountains. They will hide, they will set the camps, and they are not really reachable by the conventional forces of the army. So ultimately what they decide is, if we cannot quash the rebellion, we are going to destroy the social environment around them. In the higher ground you have the rebels, in the lower ground you have the villages. They are very closely related. Basically the men go to the mountains with the guerrillas, and the female and the children and the elder stay in the villages with their businesses. They visit, the rebels go down to the villages all the time to raise taxes, money, or food, or recruits, or anything they need. So it's a very closely symbiotic relationship. Everybody knows that. President Bashir knows that very well. So in his frustration, shall we say, or in that context, he says the only way to destroy them is to destroy the social environment, right? That is a crime. Fighting the guerrillas as such wouldn't be a crime. But fighting it by the means of destroying the civilians around them is definitely a war crime or a crime against humanity, or in this case, it could be also a genocide, because there is a deliberate intent to destroy the ethnic group in whole or in part. That is the definition of genocide under the Genocide Convention of 1948 and Article 6 of our statute. So, you see my point, we need to understand the point of view of the perpetrator, and this is why the research that we've heard today could be so important for us. We have different types of cases. Sometimes we just have the leader and we have a particular incident, but many more times what we have is a pattern of multiple incidents that are attributable by a leader and his system, right? This doesn't happen so often. This is what happens in our cases in DRC, Uganda, Darfur, Central African Republic, Kenya, Libya, etc. So this poses some methodological dilemmas for us, right? We will never be able to capture the whole scope of the evidence and investigate every single incident when we are looking at campaigns of violence that last for months or years and involve hundreds over hundreds of incidents. That's impossible. So how do you tell the story? How do you capture the truth about the patterns? And essentially, just like as you would do in social sciences, you need some sampling strategy. But as we know, sampling is in principle a valid method, but a very sensitive one. You can get it wrong easily with sampling. So we face similar dilemmas, and basically what we will do is to investigate some incidents in greater depth and then build pattern evidence on the rest and put everything together, assess that in a way as rigorous as we can do, and take it from there. The most responsible, we've said that, but how do you know who is most responsible? What does that mean? We cannot just axiomatically say if someone is the boss, he must be responsible. That's not enough. What we mean is most responsible in the terms of primary causation of the crime, right? So inevitably, for every single investigation, we need to investigate the structure, the system that was used to commit the crime. And you have different systems. Some are charismatic, others are bureaucratic, using the distinction of Max Weber, right? So the big man, and everybody follows him directly. The second model is just a classic bureaucratic system, as you will have in a conventional army. But then you also have networks, flat systems, where it's much less clear who is in charge. By the way, there are combinations. You have networks acting together with bureaucratic institutions and so on. Endless complexity, and I tell you, a lot of work for the investigators and the analysts. Okay, now, what are the main causal factors? Why is this happening, right? Addressing the core questions of the seminar. In our cases, this is what we see. This is what we can see in the whole scope of cases. I will explain this model, and I will review that with some examples. Essentially, we look at the culture, at the process, and at the profit, right? The culture, very simply, in very simple, plain terms, these are pre-existing values and identities, right? Whether a tribal identity, national, etc., but also other values related to the rule of law, gender, military doctrine, etc. Sometimes you have what Raoul Hilbert would call a community of understanding. Hilbert was struggling with the idea of whether there was an order for the genocide or not, and at some point he reached the conclusion that there was not necessarily such an order, but at some point there was a very solid consensus, a community of understanding, he will say, according to which everybody knew what they had to do, and this is how they carry out the Holocaust. It's hard to believe, in a way, you know, how something, such a massive operation would grow in such an organic way. But it can happen that certain values are either so ingrained in culture or built in such a way that at some point, yes, everybody needs to know what they have to do. I remember one case in one of the investigations in Congo where we were asking an insider, right? We have to interview insiders all the time. This is indispensable to sort out the cases, right? So we were asking them, but when you attacked the village, this was a massacre in Ituri, around 200 civilians killed in one day, right? So were you attacking the soldiers, because there were some soldiers in the village, or were you attacking the civilians? And the answer was no, we were attacking everybody. And why were you doing that? Did anybody tell you that this is the way you had to carry out the attack? And the answer was no, we did that way because this is the way we always carry out war. This is the normal way to carry out the war for us. So in that sense, there was such a community of understanding for them in which essentially it's a concept of total war, right? Without principle of this distinction. The principle of distinction is one of the cornerstones of international humanitarian law and means basically you shall distinguish between civilians and combatants, right? In some cultures, in some systems, that principle doesn't exist. Hence, war equals attacking everybody at the same time, including civilians. In the case of Sudan, some military experts will tell us the same, which is that the Sudanese army does not use the principle of distinction. For them, it's completely normal to overrun a village and kill everybody in the village, whether civilian or combatant. Very often there is a mixture of both. It's not necessarily always a black and white picture. But of course, the combatant under international law has an obligation to distinguish, I'm saying. But some systems, including, according to some people, the Sudanese army, do not have that in their culture. Another indicator there, a more fine line there, would be noticeable in relation to the Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1977. Additional Protocol 1 is the most sophisticated, if you wish, most advanced instrument of international law regarding the distinction and the protection for civilians and so on. There are some states that have ratified, have chosen to ratify the Additional Protocol, and others that have not. You can predict that those that choose not to ratify Additional Protocol 1, they are less, they will be more lenient in their standards, and you will factor that in your analysis of culture. The next point is process. Crime doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is more of an ecosystem, and the criminals are responding to different things, different events and stimuli happening in their context. It's always like that. It's not purely out of the blue. It's an evolving response. Because there are precedents, you may remember how Hannah Arendt will say, in a broader historical sense, that the horrors of totalitarianism and Nazism must be understood against the horrors of World War I. In a way, all the carnage, the massive deaths in World War I, got people used to that scale of violence, and then that contributed to that habit somehow. Of course, we have the issue of escalation all the time. This is very, very common. This is what, talking about Holocaust, what the historian Hans Mommsen would call cumulative radicalization, right? So it goes in incremental steps. We see that in many cases as well. And we have the issue of retaliation, right? I mentioned the case of the massacre. This is a massacre in a place called Bogoro in Ituri. Yes, they were killing all these people, but it happened that a day before or a week before, they were themselves suffering the same massacres from the opposing side. So this type of reprisals are also very common. This is what in criminal law you refer to the tu quoque defense, right? Like you too did the same. And there is a clear consensus in jurisprudence that tu quoque is not a defense. It may be true that your group a week before, a day before, even an hour before, were suffering the same crime, but that cannot justify by any means responding in kind. There's a number of decisions, of judgments that make that point. Fear is very important. I didn't hear so much, there was some mentions about that, but I think we need to think more about fear. A lot of these phenomena are related to fear, the fear felt by the community or the perpetrators. They feel threatened. They may feel threatened in a way that is genuine, there is an actual threat, or it's constructed artificially by propaganda. But fear is an important motivator for all this type of violence. In the case of Vilena Plavšić, one of the Serbian leaders convicted by the ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, this is a very unique case where she pleaded guilty. The only leader that would acknowledge the crimes as they were charged in the indictment. So she was given the opportunity in a hearing to explain herself. And she had a very elaborate speech, actually. She did acknowledge entirely the crime. There was no excuses. She said, I was part of the system. We expelled civilians. We carried out ethnic cleansing. There was killings. There was rape. There was the whole thing. It was a full acknowledgement. And then she would say, you would ask me, how come that I realized today that we did that, and I didn't realize that at the time, and this is in between 92 to 94, and her answer was because of fear. We were so afraid that our community, this is the Serbs of Bosnia, will suffer from attacks and from genocide the way we had suffered before, this is in World War II, that this blinded us and that led us to commit such violence. There are different interpretations of that. Some people believe her, some people say she was just pretending to get a lower sentence, but in any event, we do believe that there is a point in that, and we need to think more about the influence of fear, right? I mentioned counterinsurgency issues. This is very common. We see that in the case of Darfur, in the case of crimes committed in Libya and in many others. And very often what we have is a scenario of hostage taking. Essentially, the perpetrators hold a minority as hostages, and they claim some gains from the enemies or from the international community, and they say, if you don't give me what I want, I'm going to kill the hostages. Just like in a case of robbing a bank and holding the personnel there or so. And of course, there is no clear answer of what do you do with that, There may be a number of ways of addressing a hostage-taking scenarios. Some authorities, some governments will take a very blunt approach and they will go and kill everybody, the criminals and the hostages and everybody. And others will take a softer approach of negotiation or so. We saw that in the case of Kosovo. I forgot to mention that I worked in ICTY, in the Yugoslavia Tribunal, before working in the ICC. So, in the case of Kosovo, that was the situation, right? You have the Albanian population of Kosovo, and then you have the Serbian government. And the Serbian government said very clearly, if you attack us, this is a message to the US primarily and NATO, it will be the Albanians who will pay for that. We will immediately take reprisals on the Albanians, and that's exactly what happened. And this is how the massive violence and expulsion of the Albanian population in Kosovo took place, right? Some people, of course, make the point that that's what happened also in World War II and in the Holocaust, right? Essentially, the Jewish population in Europe became hostages of the Nazi regime. They said, if you attack us and if you bomb us, they will pay for that, and that's what happened at a much horrific and huge scale, right? And finally, profit. Of course, there are elements of self-interest and profit and rational choice related to the benefits anticipated by the perpetrator, right? Which may be about power or money or looting natural resources and so on. The issue of land is very important. I will recommend you to take a look at the works of Mahmoud Mamdani, one of the leading scholars from Africa. He's Ugandan, where he explains the whole issue of the genocide in Rwanda against the background of the land property issues, essentially so that the Tutsis were the landowner elite versus the Hutu, who were the peasants and the workers, the underclass there. And an important motivating factor for the Hutus to commit the genocide was certainly to keep the benefits of land reform that the government had passed, because they feared going back to the old regime, quasi, a feudal regime of land ownership. The same happened in the case of Ituri, that I mentioned before, quite common. So, of course, you have different types of factors and different issues that will relate to the more rational part of ourselves and our brains. This is rational choice, or the deeper feelings of identity, belonging, or fear. And we don't have a single explanatory model. There is no single paradigm in our view that explains all these different types of crimes. This is much more diverse and complex than that. These are some of our main accused. By the way, there is something about geography here. All these people are from one given continent, which is Africa. And many people will ask us the question, why are you working so much in Africa? This looks like a little racist, some people would say, as an honest question, and certainly as a biased question by the accused themselves. They make the point all the time. And in short, the answer to that is because they are asking us to do so. We operate to a large extent upon request, and we are operating upon request by the civil society in African countries and governments that are actually referring the situations and telling us, please come and investigate, because this is too much for us to take in terms of the gravity of the crime, as well as the capacity of the national systems. Most of our cases follow from referrals, national referrals from state parties, and a couple of our cases follow from referrals from the UN Security Council, right? So President Bashir, Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, Joseph Kony and Dominic Ongwen, Joseph Kony, the top leader of the Lord Resistance Army and one of his deputies. The case of Dominic Ongwen, the last man there, is quite interesting because he was a victim himself in the first place. This is a man that was captured as a hostage when he was a child, something like 10 years old or so, and then he became a commander. And he became particularly cruel and active in committing the crime, which is why he was promoted as one of the top commanders. From our viewpoint, we look at the top, most notorious commanders, we focused on them. And when we make that prioritization, say that selection, it so happens that one of those very bad commanders was initially a victim, but we will not exculpate him from that. This will raise, of course, social and moral dilemmas and so on, but the way we go is just driven by the evidence. There is this person who was particularly notorious in killing, torturing, raping, sexual enslavement, and the rest of that. Whether he was, 10, 15 years before a victim himself, it doesn't count for us. It doesn't count for the victims in the first place. We're gathering the evidence from the victims, and the victims would highlight that. They will report him. They will identify him as a particularly bad commander. This is not our idea. It's the perception and the legitimate claim of the victims in the first place, and it's also the majority view on the local society. Jean-Pierre Bemba, I mentioned him. His case is very much focused on rape as well. Thomas Lubanga from Congo, child soldiers. Bosco Ntaganda, his trial is going on these days in The Hague. Germain Katanga, convicted for the massacre of Bogoro, those 200 killings. Monsieur Bakbo and Simone Bakbo, his wife. Here we have husband, wife, and the only wife, the only woman so far accused in our cases. This is related to elections. This is the electoral issue, right? This is a man who was in power and could not accept that the opposition will win the elections. So he refused to give up power to the point of triggering a whole conflict and a whole civil war. So it's a very rational choice, if you wish, there, you know, of I must stay in power. But this choice is also built against cultural issues. His issue is nationalism in Côte d'Ivoire. It's the issue of the local original Ivorian population against the immigrants and so on. You have something of that kind with William Ruto, Vice President of the Republic of Kenya, also about elections. In this case, the official results gave the victory to the other side, and he refused to accept the results, and again he launched mass violence. And the last case is from the last person, Ahmad Al-Faki, from Mali. This is an issue of cultural destruction. This is a militant Islamic group related to Al-Qaeda who decides to take Tombouctou and destroy a number of mosques, monuments, and so on. And this is why we are accusing him. So this is the way it would look, taking these examples, right? If we look again at culture, process, and profit, and we look at the different examples I gave you, you will see that this is it's there in different combinations. Not exactly the same way for every case. I'm saying different scenarios. Obviously, the worst, the gravest crime comes from ticking the box for every element, right? If you have a strong racist culture, which is the case in Sudan, coupled with religion in that sense, plus the military doctrine. President Bashir is a general in the army. This is all run by the army there. Plus a bad process because of the implications of counterinsurgency, plus profit in various ways, you can clearly understand that this is the most explosive combination. When we say profit, we look at power, certainly, in examples that I mentioned. There is land, I mentioned that. There is oil, certainly, in the case of Sudan. And there is sex in a certain way, right? For the case of sexual crimes, sometimes you have more strategic purposes, right? And other times you have the very simple impulse of the rapist who is enjoying the act, and that's profitable for him, right? So we cannot go to all of them, but I can mention just the other example of Bemba, in which the Bemba case is more of a mercenary scenario, in which they don't really care. It's not so important culture, or no any other element. It's just that they were asked to do that, they went and they did it, and that resulted in massive looting and sex. But also you can see that compared to the higher range, the Bemba crimes were relatively smaller, actually. You see, it's less criminal result. To conclude, we certainly work on an assumption of rationalities. Some of the presenters mentioned this before, right? Rationality not in a neurological sense, but in a legal, philosophical sense, coming from the Enlightenment. So we assume, and this is what the statute says, that everybody around is a rational being, right? The victims, the perpetrators make rational choices. They are conscious of the consequences of their decisions. We assume that the witnesses are also rational, else we would not trust their evidence. And by the way, we have to assume the same for the judges, right? Our take on this discussion would be that, sure, there can be ordinary men, but there is not such a thing as ordinary leaders involved in the crime. These are extraordinarily evil people, in the sense that, as Baron d'Estournel de Constant would say, and it's about people at the level of Milgram, which means you will see that Milgram is 3 steps removed from the victim, right? There's the victim, there's the operator, there's the instructor, and there's Milgram, right? So people remove some, minimum 3 steps from the immediate violence. As I said, there is no single paradigm. There are many different types of crimes, including sexual crimes. And we believe that further research can actually help us, can help our investigations in at different levels. I mentioned yesterday the issue of modeling. Very often we cannot catch explicit, clear orders, but we do see the leaders influencing their followers in more subtle ways. Some people refer to the issue of neuronal Wi-Fi. I don't know if you've heard about this idea, and how there may be a neuronal connection between different people in very invisible or subtle ways. We're interested to hear more about that. We certainly always need to hear about cognitive psychology and memory. Thank you for that. It's fundamental from the viewpoint of the victim and witness recollection. And we think also that the psychology of investigations, as some people call it, is also necessary for us to improve our methods. This is the psychology of us, investigators and analysts, to correct confirmation biases and various biases in the process. Let me just mention that we have something called the Visiting Professional Program. You can find all the information in our site, and this is designed precisely for researchers and academics to come and spend some time with us and exchange some ideas and help with research, help each other with research. Thank you very much.